The morning started the way most of them did around here. Me and Maggie sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the sun rise over the oak trees. Our old hound, Duke, was dozing at our feet, and the scent of fresh biscuits floated out from the kitchen window. Peaceful, quiet, the kind of morning people move to the country to have. That is, until 6 golf carts, flashing dollar store red and blue lights, came barreling down the gravel driveway like we were in some kind of low-budget action movie. They skidded to a stop in a half-circle formation, kicking up dust and feathers, and before I could even set my coffee down, a man no older than 25, wearing a Halloween store badge and an oversized utility belt, pointed at my wife and shouted, "Ma'am, you're under arrest." Just like that. No warm-up. No explanation. My wife, sitting there in pajama pants and one of my old flannel shirts, blinking at him like he'd just told her the moon was made of cheddar. For a second, I honestly thought it was a prank. Maggie tilted her head, gave me one of those raised eyebrow glances, then looked back at the kid like she was waiting for the punchline. He wasn't joking. Neither were the 5 other wannabe cops flanking him, standing stiff as fence posts, each holding plastic walkie-talkies and clipboards like they were about to lead a hostage negotiation. The leader stepped forward, cleared his throat, and said, "You are in direct violation of the Cedar Hills Homeowners Association Code, subsection 14B7, relating to mailbox appearance and driveway conformity." He said it like he was reading off a courtroom verdict. Maggie took another slow sip of her coffee. Duke snorted awake and let out a half-hearted woof. "Now, you gotta understand something. We don't even live inside the HOA limit. Our land is county property, grandfathered in since Maggie's great-granddad built this house with his own 2 hands. But try telling that to the Cedar Hills HOA board, who've been sniffing around our fence line for years, thinking they could strong-arm us into joining their little dictatorship. They tried fines, letters, and veiled threats, but apparently, today, they decided to up their game and play dress-up." The young man adjusted his plastic badge, puffed out his chest, and said, "You'll need to come with us down to the clubhouse for processing." I swear on my mother's peach cobbler, I almost spit coffee straight across the porch. Maggie didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back, crossed her legs, and said real calm, "Do you boys even know who you're talking to?" He blinked, confused, looking between us like maybe we hadn't fully grasped the gravity of the situation. One of the others, a wiry woman with a laminated HOA ID hanging around her neck like it meant something, chimed in. "You're required by HOA law to comply or you'll face additional penalties." HOA law. Not county law. Not state law. HOA law. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard trying not to laugh I nearly drew blood. Maggie, bless her, kept a straight face and took another sip of coffee. Then, cool as ice, she said, "You might want to check with the county judge before you try slapping cuffs on me." The leader scoffed and said, "Oh, we've got full authority." At this point, I should have felt worried, but watching them standing there with their clipboards and matching golf carts, I was more entertained than anything else. Maggie looked over at me again, this time with a tiny grin, the kind of grin that meant somebody was about to regret their life choices. I knew what they didn't. See, Maggie wasn't just anybody. She was the daughter of Judge Lambert, the most feared, respected, and no-nonsense county judge in the Tri-County area. The same judge who made headlines last year for sentencing a wealthy land developer to personally rebuild a historical bridge he tried to demolish without a permit. That man. And these HOA kids had no idea they were about to poke the bear. But they didn't back down. No, sir. They actually tried to step onto the porch like they were going to physically detain her. Maggie set her coffee down carefully, stood up slow, and said, "Touch me, and you're going to have a much bigger problem than mailbox violations." The young man hesitated, clearly realizing he might have bitten off more than he could chew, but pride's a funny thing. He gestured to the others, and they started climbing the steps like they were about to win themselves a medal. That's when Duke stood up. Now, Duke ain't exactly ferocious, but he's big, stubborn, and protective. The minute he saw strangers approaching Maggie, he let out a deep, bone-rattling growl, the kind that makes you reconsider all your life choices. They froze mid-step. The leader's face turned a shade paler. Maggie gently scratched Duke behind the ear and said, "Good boy." And just like that, the spell broke. The HOA officers backed down the steps, muttering about needing to double-check procedures. They piled back into their golf carts, sped off like scared raccoons, leaving behind a trail of dust and confusion. Maggie sat back down, picked up her coffee, and said, "I give him 2 hours before they make it worse." I knew she was right. With Maggie, it's never a matter of if someone's going to regret messing with her. It's only ever when. And judging by the look on her face, the when was coming real soon. The next morning came with a familiar stillness, the kind that usually meant something was brewing just beyond the tree line. Maggie moved through the kitchen like it was any other day, humming while frying bacon, but I could see the wheels turning behind that steady look of hers. She was calm on the surface, but I knew better. I'd seen her like this when the neighbor's cattle broke through the fence last fall, and she somehow had them corralled, fed, and marched back home before the owner even noticed. Maggie didn't panic. Maggie plotted. As for me, I was still trying to decide if what happened yesterday was real or some sort of collective fever dream caused by too much sun and bad HOA drama. After breakfast, I wandered into town and found myself sitting across from Sheriff Tate at the diner, both of us sipping burnt coffee that tasted like it had been reheated 3 times. He listened quietly as I walked him through the scene on the porch, his face betraying nothing but the occasional twitch of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. When I got to the part about the HOA trying to physically arrest Maggie, he set his cup down and asked flatly, "They actually said arrest?" I nodded. Used the word like they owned it. Sheriff Tate leaned back in the booth, arms crossed, shaking his head. These HOA folks think they're running their own little county. He wiped his mouth with a napkin and said, "Reckon it's about time somebody showed him they ain't." Meanwhile, Maggie was back home, gathering little details like a fox sniffing out a henhouse. She had already pulled out a file from her father's old cabinet, filled with all the legal paperwork proving our land wasn't, never had been, and never would be under HOA control. Not that we needed the paperwork. It was common knowledge around here that the Cedar Hills HOA had about as much legal authority over us as a lemonade stand on the side of the highway. But the problem wasn't about law. It was about pride. And HOA folks, especially this bunch, had more pride than sense. By lunchtime, the HOA made their next move. I returned home to find our front gate littered with fresh notices. Neon-colored flyers were stapled to the fence posts, taped to our mailbox, even flapping from Duke's doghouse like they were staging a one-house yard sale. They read things like mandatory appearance notice, immediate compliance required, and my personal favorite, illegal modification citation, Class B offense. Maggie was sitting on the porch swing, sipping sweet tea, watching as I pulled them down one by one. "They even put one on Duke," I said, holding up the ridiculous flyer stapled to the edge of his roof. Maggie barely glanced up. "They're just warming up," she replied, swinging gently. Sure enough, by sunset, the whole town was buzzing. Word spread fast out here, especially when you have a good scandal. The waitress at the diner was whispering about it. The folks at the feed store were chuckling behind the counter, and I swear old Mr. Garland from the gas station offered me popcorn like it was a movie about to start. Maggie wasn't bothered. In fact, I could tell she was enjoying it in that quiet, calculating way she had. She knew it wasn't about stopping them right away. It was about letting them hang themselves with their own rope. Later that evening, just as we were settling in to enjoy a movie, headlights swept across the living room window. I stepped out to find the same group of self-appointed HOA enforcers unloading folding chairs, a portable podium, and a box labeled trial materials onto the community clubhouse lawn across the road. They weren't even subtle. They'd set up a makeshift courtroom complete with a plastic judge's bench, lawn chairs for jury seating, and a banner strung between two trees that read Cedar Hills HOA Special Tribunal. Maggie stood beside me on the porch, arms crossed, a small grin creeping onto her face like she'd just been handed the punchline to the world's best joke. They left another official summons on our front door, demanding Maggie appear before the HOA tribunal at noon sharp tomorrow, or else face escalating penalties. The sheer audacity of it would have been maddening if it hadn't been so absurd. Maggie pulled the flyer off the door, folded it neatly, and set it on the kitchen table like it was a dinner invitation. Then she calmly made a phone call. Only 2 words were spoken before she hung up. "Daddy, it's time." The next morning arrived with a strange combination of anticipation and hilarity. Folks were already gathering near the clubhouse, pretending to walk dogs, jog, or check their mail, but everyone knew they were just here to watch the spectacle unfold. Even Sheriff Tate drove by real slow, tipping his hat to us as he passed. The HOA was dressed to impress, or so they thought. The president stood at the podium wearing a thrift store robe, holding a gavel that looked suspiciously like the handle of a broken shovel. His jury consisted of 3 other board members, each with clipboards and a pile of pre-written verdicts. Maggie didn't flinch. She dressed like she was going to the farmer's market. Jeans, boots, and a simple blouse, but the confidence on her face was worth more than any courtroom suit. I trailed behind her, mostly to carry Duke, who insisted on coming but had no interest in walking himself. The HOA president banged his makeshift gavel and called the trial to order, announcing that Maggie was facing charges of noncompliance, property violations, and obstruction of HOA justice, whatever that meant. He barely finished his dramatic opening when Maggie calmly raised her hand. "Before we continue," she said, loud enough for the whole crowd to hear, "I'd like you to meet someone." The faint sound of a car door slamming made every head turn. Judge Lambert himself, towering in his black robe and looking like he had just stepped straight out of a proper courtroom, marched up the path, trailed by Sheriff Tate and 2 deputies. The crowd gasped. The president stammered, clutching his clipboard like it might shield him from divine judgment. Maggie didn't need to say another word. The pieces were already moving, and I could tell the game was about to change. The so-called tribunal was about to have its authority tested, and I had a feeling it was going to fail spectacularly. Maggie gave me a sideways glance, eyes twinkling, and whispered, "I told you they'd make it worse." I nodded, unable to hide the grin that had been fighting its way to my face all morning. The real show was just about to begin. The clubhouse lawn had never seen a crowd like this. Half the town had shown up, pretending to be out for a casual stroll or a morning jog, but nobody was fooling anyone. Folding chairs popped up like mushrooms, kids sat cross-legged on the grass, and even old man Turner rolled up in his lawn chair with a jug of sweet tea like he was front row at the county fair. The HOA president stood frozen behind the podium, eyes darting between Judge Lambert, Sheriff Tate, and the 2 deputies who flanked them like bookends. Maggie, standing cool as ever, just let the silence stretch, letting every second of tension thicken the air. It wasn't just about calling their bluff anymore. This was a full-on reckoning. The president cleared his throat and tried to muster some authority. Judge Lambert, we were, conducting a private community tribunal, if you'd like to observe." His words trailed off as the judge stepped forward, slow and deliberate, like every step carried the weight of the law itself. Judge Lambert didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a long look at the ridiculous scene before him. The fake bench, the homemade gavel, the shoddy robes, and the smug faces of the HOA board. He glanced back at the growing crowd and said, loud enough for even the folks on the sidewalk to hear, "Is this a joke, or have y'all really lost your minds?" You could practically hear the oxygen get sucked out of the whole neighborhood. The president stammered, fumbling with his clipboard. We have full authority to enforce HOA code. Our charter grants us judicial." He was cut off by the judge raising one finger. It wasn't rude or loud. Just one slow, deliberate motion that shut the president up like a muzzle. Sheriff Tate stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his pocket, handing it to the judge, who unfolded it with care and read it aloud. State Code 16.4, impersonating a law enforcement officer, punishable by fines and imprisonment. State Code 18.7, unlawful detention attempt. State Code 20.3, harassment and intimidation of a private citizen. The judge's eyes locked on the president. Would you like me to keep going? The HOA board was frozen. The jury members' clipboards visibly trembled. One of them looked like she might bolt at any second, and I saw at least two quietly sliding backward toward their golf carts like nobody would notice. Maggie stood there, arms crossed, watching them squirm. Sipping from a water bottle like this was nothing more than her morning entertainment. Sheriff Tate wasn't smiling, but I could tell he was enjoying every second. The deputies stood stone-faced, ready for business. The president, desperate to salvage what little dignity he had left, tried to straighten his back. We were simply enforcing community guidelines, he insisted. It's within our rights as an HOA. Judge Lambert raised his voice just enough to echo across the lot. You left your rights the moment you slapped plastic badges on and tried to arrest my daughter on her own porch. The murmurs from the crowd rose into open whispers and even a few chuckles. The HOA's homemade courtroom, which had probably seemed like a great idea 24 hours ago, now looked like the set of a school play falling apart at intermission. The judge took another step forward, casting a long shadow over the podium. This, he gestured to the entire ridiculous setup, isn't a courtroom. It's a backyard circus, and you're the clowns. That did it. The jury scattered first. Clipboards were dropped, robes were discarded mid-run, and one board member tripped over a lawn chair as she made a beeline for the nearest golf cart. The president stood frozen, blinking at the judge like he was still trying to process what was happening. Sheriff Tate stepped up, hand resting casually on his belt. Go ahead and turn around for me, son. The president's shoulders sagged as if the full weight of the situation finally hit him. Without argument, he turned, and the sheriff snapped cuffs on his wrists with a satisfying click. The crowd erupted in gasps and whispered commentary. Duke, who had been napping under Maggie's chair the whole time, let out a lazy bark of approval as if to punctuate the moment. Maggie's grin widened as she watched it all unfold like a show she'd seen a dozen times before. The president was gently escorted to the back of the sheriff's cruiser, his cheap badge hanging crooked as he ducked his head to avoid the doorframe. Once the president was secured, Judge Lambert turned to address the crowd directly. I suggest anyone else involved in this little production head home and consider what charges they might be facing. I'll be expecting full cooperation when the deputies come knocking. There wasn't a single soul left in that HOA contingent who dared make eye contact. Golf carts peeled away one after another, robes trailing behind them, leaving behind only discarded clipboards, a makeshift podium, and a deflated sense of self-importance. The crowd slowly began to disperse, some folks shaking their heads in disbelief, others laughing openly. People patted Maggie on the back, congratulating her like she'd just won the county fair pie contest. Sheriff Tate gave us a nod. We'll be in touch, he said, more out of habit than necessity. Maggie, calm as ever, thanked him and started back toward the house like it was just another day. I followed, trying to keep a straight face, but the grin was winning. Back at the porch, we watched the last of the spectacle fade down the road. Maggie sat back down on the swing, kicked off her boots, and poured herself another glass of sweet tea. Think they'll try again? I asked, half joking. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the now empty clubhouse lawn, the fake courtroom dismantled, and said, "Oh, they'll think about it. But next time, they'll remember today." Duke let out a satisfied sigh at our feet, like even he knew this chapter was closing. But Maggie's eyes held that familiar glint, the one that told me it wasn't quite over yet. Not because she wanted more, but because there were always some fools who couldn't take a hint. The difference now was that everyone knew, plain as day, whose daughter they'd been messing with. And next time, there wouldn't be a warning. Only judgment. In the days that followed, the town couldn't seem to talk about anything else. At the diner, folks replayed the scene like it was the last 5 minutes of a football game. Down at the hardware store, someone had drawn a cartoon of the HOA president in cuffs and taped it to the bulletin board, where it quickly gathered a healthy collection of approving signatures. Even at church on Sunday, old Pastor Grady nearly lost his place in the sermon when he caught sight of Judge Lambert sitting in the back pew with Maggie, both of them looking as innocent as could be. Word had traveled faster than gossip usually does in a small town, and it wasn't just locals who knew. People from 2 counties over were driving through Cedar Hills just to catch a glimpse of the infamous clubhouse where the fake trial had gone down. It was like our little corner of the world had become the setting of a living folk tale, and Maggie was at the center of it all. As for the HOA, well, they kept a low profile. Real low. Most of them were nowhere to be seen. Those who did dare to show their faces scurried past the townsfolk with their heads down and their lips sealed tighter than a mason jar lid. It was as if overnight, the entire board had realized that maybe, just maybe, impersonating law enforcement wasn't something you could explain away as a misunderstanding. Sheriff Tate, true to his word, paid each of them a personal visit. The word around town was that most of them confessed faster than a sinner at a tent revival. Charges were filed, fines were issued, and community service hours were generously handed out. Watching the same people who had strutted around like they owned the place now picking up litter along the county roads was a sight sweeter than fresh peach cobbler. Maggie didn't gloat. She didn't have to. She went about her business like nothing happened, planting spring vegetables, helping old Mrs. Weaver fix her porch steps, and even baking a few pies for the church bake sale. That's just how she was. Quiet about her wins, but sharp enough to make sure nobody forgot. Judge Lambert, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy himself more openly. He'd tip his hat and wink at folks whenever the subject came up, which was often. He even joked at the diner one morning that he might have to consider holding court at the clubhouse more often since they'd already set it up once, gavel and all. Sheriff Tate nearly spit his coffee across the counter. It wasn't long before official notices went up, stating that the Cedar Hills HOA had been placed under full investigation by the county. Turns out, the fake cops and phony tribunal were just the tip of the iceberg. Their books were a mess, dues had been misplaced, and several past fines handed out to neighbors weren't just excessive, they were illegal. The new interim board, hastily put together after the arrests, resigned within a week, realizing they didn't want any part of the disaster left behind. Rumors swirled about the state stepping in to formally dissolve the HOA altogether, though nothing was official yet. The best part? Maggie never lifted a finger beyond that first warning. She simply let them do what they were always going to do, make fools of themselves. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the so-called tribunal, we were sitting back on the porch enjoying another quiet evening. Duke was sprawled out under the swing, chasing rabbits in his dreams, and Maggie was flipping through one of those gardening catalogs she loved so much. I noticed her eyeing a new windmill design, probably already imagining where it would go on the property. That's when Sheriff Tate pulled up the drive, dust trailing behind his truck like a ribbon. He stepped out holding a brown paper package under one arm and a grin on his face. "Thought you two might appreciate this," he said, handing Maggie the package. Inside was a brand new mailbox sign, engraved with fine, deep lettering that read, "Property protected by judge's daughter. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Maggie laughed, genuinely laughed, as she ran her fingers over the smooth wood. Sheriff Tate tipped his hat. "Figured you'd like a reminder for the next batch of knuckleheads who don't know better." Maggie nodded and said, "I love it." We mounted it right then and there. No ceremony, no speeches, just a quiet satisfaction as the sun started dipping below the hills. Days passed, and slowly life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it gets when your front porch becomes a local landmark. Tourists, if you could call them that, started stopping by just to snap photos of the now famous sign. Maggie didn't seem to mind. Sometimes, she'd even wave from the porch swing, sipping sweet tea like the queen of the county, which, in some ways, she was. The best part was watching the former HOA board members shuffle past in their orange community service vests, picking up roadside trash under the watchful eye of Deputy Miller, who took great pleasure in reminding them, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear, that impersonating a law officer sure does come with consequences. A few neighbors even chipped in to commission a plaque for the clubhouse wall that read, "The Great Cedar Hills Tribunal, in memory of the day foolishness met justice." When Maggie saw it, she chuckled and said, "Well, at least they'll remember." And they did. Every time someone walked past that clubhouse, they were reminded of the day they learned the hard way who Maggie really was. But Maggie didn't let it change her. She still woke up early, still pulled weeds from the garden, still baked pies for anyone who needed cheering up. And when the town offered to throw her a celebration dinner at the diner, she politely declined. "I've had enough attention for 1 year," she said with a wink. But of course, folks showed up with casseroles and desserts anyway, filling the diner with laughter and stories. Nobody talked about her like a hero, though. They talked about her like family, like someone who just did what needed doing when the time came. As for me, I learned a valuable lesson sitting on that porch watching it all unfold. Sometimes you don't need to raise your voice, flash a badge, or swing a gavel to put things right. Sometimes all you need is a wife who knows exactly who she is, who knows the law better than anyone, and who isn't afraid to let fools dig their own holes. And as the sun set over the hills and the evening breeze carried the scent of Maggie's fresh-baked apple pie out across the yard, I figured that was about as good as life get.